Ilara had built a fortress of silence around her heart, each day a new stone laid upon the last, mortared with the dust of memory. The world beyond the neat lines of her homestead was a ghost she refused to acknowledge, its laughter and its sorrows a language she no longer spoke. The prairie winds that swept across the plains carried no comfort, only the endless, hollow sound of her own solitude. For 2 years since she had buried Liam, and the tiny, unnamed child that followed him into the earth, her life had contracted to the size of her small cabin and the patch of land she worked with grim, mechanical efficiency. The fence was always mended, the well water always clear, the garden always free of weeds. It was a life of perfect order and profound emptiness. The trip into the town of redemption was a necessity she postponed until the flour bin was scraped clean and the salt was a mere white whisper at the bottom of its sack. She hated the town. Hated the pitying glances from the women and the speculative stares from the men. Hated the noise and the press of bodies, a stark contrast to the vast, quiet space she now called her own. But today, the emptiness of her larder was more insistent than the emptiness in her soul, so she hitched the mare to the buckboard and set off, her face a stoic mask against the morning sun. Redemption was louder than she remembered, a raw collection of plank buildings huddled against the dust. A crowd was gathered in the central square, not for a hanging or a preacher, but for something that felt just as grim. An auction. Not of land or cattle, but of people. Orphans, the remnants of a fever-racked wagon train that had collapsed a month's ride east. The town council, in its finite wisdom, had decided the most efficient way to deal with the leftover children was to indenture them for their keep and labor. Ilara tried to steer her wagon around the gathering, a cold sickness rising in her throat, but the throng was too thick. She was forced to stop, a captive audience to the grim spectacle. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and sweat-stained collar, was trying to sell a boy of 10, extolling his strong back and willing hands. Then, he brought out the last lot. They were triplets, 2 boys and a girl, no older than 7. They stood on the crude wooden platform, a single, trembling unit of fear. Their clothes were rags, their faces smudged with dirt and tears, but their matching blue eyes were wide with a terror so pure it was a physical blow. They held hands in a desperate chain, a tiny island in a sea of indifferent faces. The auctioneer sighed, his professional enthusiasm failing him. "A matched set," he said, with a weak attempt at a joke that fell flat. "3 for the price of one's trouble, I suppose. What am I bid for the lot?" A cruel silence answered him. Men looked at their boots. Women whispered behind their hands. 3 mouths to feed. 3 sets of clothes to mend. 3 bodies that might succumb to the next winter's cough. They were a burden, a miscalculation of fate. Then, a voice cut through the quiet. $20. It was Silas Blackwood, a rancher whose lands bordered the far side of the valley. A man known for his hard fences and harder heart. His face was a knot of avarice, his eyes sweeping over the children as if they were scrawny calves. He saw cheap labor for his mines, nothing more. The auctioneer looked relieved. $20 from Mr. Blackwood. A charitable man. Do I hear 25? No one spoke. The children flinched as Blackwood's gaze lingered on them. The little girl buried her face in her brother's shoulder. It was in that moment that something in Ilara's fortress cracked. The stones shifted. Through the dust and the callous disregard, she saw not 3 orphans, but 1. The one she had lost. The one she had never held. A tide of fury, cold and clean, washed away the grief-numbed apathy. It was the first thing she had truly felt in 2 years. Her voice, when it came, was rusted from disuse but clear as a bell in the sudden hush. $50. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Heads swiveled in her direction, mouths agape. Silas Blackwood's head snapped around, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. The widow from the dry gulch? The town ghost? He scowled, his pride stung. 60, he barked. 100, Ilara said, her gaze locked not on Blackwood, but on the children. The auctioneer's jaw worked silently. He looked from the stony-faced widow to the furious rancher. $100, he stammered. Ilara did not waver. The money was nearly all she had, the sum from selling off Liam's prize ball. It was meant to last her through 2 more winters. But winters were just a measure of time, and time was something she had ceased to value. Blackwood glared, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He saw the finality in her eyes, the unbending line of her spine. It was not a contest of money, but of will, and he saw in her a will he could not break today. He spat into the dust. "Let the crazy widow have them," he sneered, turning his back. A murmur ran through the crowd, a mix of shock and grudging respect. The auctioneer, flustered, slammed his gavel down. "Sold." To the widow Calloway, for $100. Ilara walked toward the platform, her purse held tight in her hand. The town parted for her like water. She ignored them all, her focus solely on the 3 small figures who stared at her as if she were an avenging angel or a new nightmare. She paid the auctioneer, her hand steady. Then she turned to the children and knelt, bringing herself to their level. She didn't smile. She didn't offer soft words. She simply looked at them, at the fear and the faint, flickering ember of hope, and made a silent vow. Her voice was quiet, for their ears only. "Come," she said. "We are going home." The journey back to the homestead was wrapped in a silence more profound than any Ilara had ever known. It was not the peaceful quiet of solitude, but a taut, fragile thing, stretched thin between her own uncertainty and the children's bottomless terror. They sat huddled together in the back of the buckboard, small and still as frightened birds, their identical blue eyes tracking the desolate landscape as if expecting new horrors to rise from the sagebrush. The plains stretched out, vast and unforgiving, the sun beating down on the cracked earth. It was a mirror of her own heart, a place where little grew and the horizons were empty. She did not press them for names, nor for the story that had etched such shadows into their young faces. Grief had taught her the tyranny of questions, the violence of forced comfort. She simply drove, the rhythmic clop of the mare's hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels the only sounds in their new, shared world. When they arrived, the cabin seemed smaller, starker than it had that morning. It was a testament to a life lived alone, everything in its place, clean and functional and without joy. The sight of it, through their eyes, gave her a pang of doubt. What had she done? This was no home for children, it was a memorial. She led them inside. The air was cool and smelled of pine soap and wood smoke. She showed them the small room off the main living space. It had been meant for her child. The small bed was neatly made, a quilt her own mother had stitched lying folded at its foot. In the corner, covered by a simple cloth, was a cradle Liam had carved from mountain ash. She had never been able to bring herself to move it. A wave of a familiar, gut-wrenching grief washed over her, so sharp she had to brace herself against the doorframe. She took a slow, steadying breath and turned back to them, her face betraying nothing. That night, she made a simple stew of salted pork and potatoes. They sat at the rough-hewn table, the 3 of them on one side, she on the other. A gulf of wooden fear separated them. They ate with a mechanical, desperate haste, their eyes downcast. Later, as the shadows grew long and the prairie outside bled into a deep indigo, she lit a single lamp. The children retreated to a corner, watching her with a wariness usually reserved for wolves. Ilara took a soft cloth and a bottle of oil and sat by the hearth. She began to clean Liam's rifle. It was not an act of aggression, but a ritual, a familiar comfort. The smooth, cool weight of the steel in her hands, the precise, practiced movements. It was a promise of protection, a statement of intent. The firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, glinting in the children's wide, watchful eyes. For the first time since they had left redemption, the hard knot of fear in their postures seemed to loosen, just a fraction. The warmth of the fire was real. The solid presence of the woman was real. Perhaps, this place was real. In the dead of night, a sound broke the stillness. A dry, rasping cough, followed by a choked sob. Ilara rose from her cot. She moved without a lamp, her feet sure on the familiar floorboards. She found them huddled together on the single bed, the little girl shaking with a feverish chill. Ilara didn't speak. She dipped a cloth in the cool water of the basin and gently laid it on the girl's forehead. Then she brought a dipper of water to her lips. The girl drank, her eyes never leaving Ilara's face. When she was done, Ilara simply smoothed the blanket over her. She expected the child to flinch from her touch, but she didn't. Instead, a tiny, cold hand reached out and brushed against her own for a fleeting second before retreating. It was not a plea, or a thank you. It was a question. And in the darkness of the silent cabin, Ilara felt she had the beginning of an answer. The days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. A quiet routine began to weave itself around the four of them, a fragile tapestry of shared tasks and silent companionship. Ilara showed them how to scatter grain for the chickens, their small hands mimicking her steady, casting motion. She taught them to pull weeds from the vegetable patch, their fingers gentle around the tender shoots of corn and beans. She led them along the fence line, showing them how to test for loose posts, her own hands, calloused and capable, working with an economy of motion they watched with rapt attention. She did not command them as a master would a servant, she guided them as one would teach a necessary skill for survival. She was patient, her instructions brief and direct. The silence between them was no longer one of fear, but of observation. And slowly, like the first crack of ice on a frozen river, it began to break. It started with a single word. They were watering the mare when the taller of the two boys, the one who seemed to carry the weight of their shared trauma in the set of his shoulders, pointed a hesitant finger. "Horse?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Daisy," Ilara replied, without looking up from the trough. A moment passed. Then, "Daisy," the boy repeated, testing the shape of the word in his mouth. He was Samuel. The next day, the other boy, Caleb, let out a sharp gasp and pointed to the sky. A red-tailed hawk was circling on the thermals, a dark speck against the brilliant blue. He made no sound, but the gesture was a sentence in itself. Ilara paused, shading her eyes. "He is hunting," she said simply. The girl, Anna, was the last to emerge from her shell. One afternoon, while Ilara was mending a shirt, a faint sound drifted from the corner where the children sat. It was a hum, a fractured, hesitant melody that seemed to be pieced together from a distant memory. Ilara did not stop her needle, but the rhythm of her stitches slowed. The sound was fragile, but it was life. It filled a space in the cabin that had been empty for too long. A change was happening inside Ilara, too. The homestead was no longer just a place to endure the passage of time. The garden was not just for sustenance, it was a lesson in patience. The cabin was not just a shelter from the wind, it was filled with the soft sounds of breathing, the quiet thump of small feet on the floorboards. The fortress around her heart was not gone, but sunlight was beginning to filter through the cracks. One afternoon, her eyes caught movement on the far ridge that marked the edge of her property. A lone rider, sitting motionless on his horse, a silhouette against the sky. He was too far to make out features, but she knew. It was one of Blackwood's men. Watching. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, coiled in her stomach. She said nothing to the children, who were engrossed in a game with polished stones. She simply walked inside, picked up Liam's rifle from its place by the door, and checked the load. The weight of it was a grim reassurance. The rider was a harbinger, a foreshadowing of a storm she knew was coming. The storm arrived sooner than she expected, but it came from the sky, not the ridge. The heavens opened up, a sudden, violent squall that turned the world to a blur of grey rain and howling wind. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very bones of the cabin. The children cried out, scrambling to the center of the room and huddling together, their newfound bravery washed away by the primal fear of the tempest. Ilara latched the door and shuttered the window, plunging the room into a dim, firelit twilight. She did not offer empty reassurances that it was only weather. The world was a dangerous place, they already knew that. Instead, she stoked the fire until it blazed bright and warm, a defiant heart against the roaring dark. She sat on the floor with them, her back against the hearth. And she began to talk. She told them not a fairy tale, but a simple story of how Liam had taught her to build a roof that could withstand the prairie winds, how he could read the clouds and tell when a storm was a tantrum and when it was a threat. Her voice was a low, steady anchor in the tumult. She spoke of his quiet strength, his gentle hands. As she spoke, the children's trembling slowly subsided. Anna crept closer, leaning her small head against Ilara's knee. Samuel and Caleb watched the fire, their faces illuminated in its warm glow. By the time the storm had rumbled its way east, they had all fallen asleep on the floor by the hearth, a tangled pile of limbs and blankets. Ilara stayed awake, watching them. The firelight softened the hard lines of grief on their faces, revealing the innocent children beneath. In that moment, looking at them, she felt a fierce, terrifying wave of possession. They were not a duty. They were not a penance for her loss. They were hers. The morning broke clear and calm, the air washed clean by the storm. A fragile peace settled over the homestead, but Ilara knew it was the quiet before a battle. She saw the dust cloud on the horizon long before she heard the hoofbeats. It was not a single rider this time. 3 men, moving with the arrogant slowness of those who believe they own the ground they ride on. She sent the children inside. "Stay in your room. Do not make a sound. Do not come out until I tell you." Her voice was low and even, leaving no room for argument. They saw the look on her face and scurried away without a word, their eyes wide with a familiar dread. Ilara took Liam's rifle, walked onto the porch, and waited. Silas Blackwood reined his horse in just outside the fence, his 2 hired men flanking him like mangy dogs. His face was a mask of smug entitlement. He surveyed the small, tidy homestead with a contemptuous sneer, his eyes lingering on the neat rows of vegetables and the repaired coop. He had expected to find chaos, a woman overwhelmed. The orderliness seemed to offend him. "Calloway," he said, his voice dripping with false congeniality. "We've come to correct a mistake." Ilara stood motionless, the rifle held across her body, a solid line of defense. Her silence unnerved him more than any shouted threat could have. "There was an error at the auction," he continued, shifting in his saddle. "A misunderstanding. Those children were meant for my indenture. The council clerk registered it improperly. It was a lie so bald it was almost laughable. I've come to take them off your hands. I'll even give you your $100 back." Can't say fairer than that. Through the window behind Ilara, 3 small faces peered out, pale and frightened. She did not turn. Her gaze remained fixed on Blackwood. "They are not for sale," she said. The words were quiet, but they carried across the yard with the force of a hammer strike. Blackwood's thin veneer of civility cracked. His lip curled back from his teeth. "Don't be a fool, woman. What can you offer them? A life of dirt and loneliness? I can give them purpose. Work. They'll be at my silver claim by week's end." He paused, letting the cruelty sink in. "Though I doubt I'll keep them together. The girl's no use in a mine." The threat was clear. He would not just take them, he would shatter the only thing they had left, each other. That was the moment Ilara knew she would die on this porch before she let him pass. A cold calm settled over her. The fear was gone, burned away by a pure, protective rage. One of Blackwood's men, a lanky ruffian with dead eyes, smirked and made a move to dismount. "We'll just go get em." Bossed in a single, fluid motion, the rifle came up to Ilara's shoulder, the stock settling into the worn groove of her body as if it were an extension of her own bone and sinew. The sound of the hammer being cocked was unnaturally loud in the still air. It was a sound of absolute finality. The man froze, his hand hovering over his saddle horn. Blackwood's horse shied at the sudden tension. Ilara's eyes were chips of flint. Her voice was cold iron. One more step, it was a standoff. The sun beat down. A fly buzzed lazily past. For a long moment, the only movement was the twitching of a horse's ear. Blackwood stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He did not see a grieving, half-mad widow. He saw a woman who had lost everything and therefore had nothing left to lose. He saw the utter certainty in her eyes, the knowledge that if he pushed, she would fire. She might not get all 3 of them, but she would get one. And he saw in the steady line of that rifle barrel that it would likely be him. Silas Blackwood was a bully, and at the heart of every bully is a coward. He calculated the odds, the cost of his pride against the cost of a bullet. The equation was simple. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Have it your way," he spat, yanking on his reins. "Enjoy your little family. The winter will take them if the fever doesn't." He wheeled his horse around, digging his spurs in cruelly. "This isn't over, Calloway." The words were a curse thrown over his shoulder as they rode away, leaving a trail of dust and malice hanging in the air. Elara did not move. She did not lower the rifle. She watched until they were nothing but tiny, insignificant specks swallowed by the vastness of the prairie. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. The rifle felt impossibly heavy as she lowered it. She leaned against the porch post, her legs suddenly shaking as the flood of adrenaline receded, leaving her weak and trembling. The screen door creaked open behind her. She turned to see the 3 children standing in the doorway, their small bodies rigid with a tension that mirrored her own. Samuel, who always seemed to appoint himself their silent spokesman, took a hesitant step forward. His voice was barely a whisper. "Is he gone?" Elara managed a single, sharp nod. The word wouldn't form. She walked back inside, the children parting to let her pass. She went to the table and methodically, deliberately, unloaded the rifle. She ejected the live round, placing it carefully in the small wooden box where she kept the ammunition. She wiped the weapon down with the oily cloth and returned it to its place of honor by the hearth. The act was a ritual of closure. The war was over, now they had to navigate the peace. The threat of Blackwood lingered like a bad smell, but he did not return. The days melted into a week, then a month. Autumn bled its gold and crimson across the plains before yielding to the stark white of winter. It was a hard season. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the snow piled in deep drifts against the cabin door. But inside, there was warmth. Inside, there was life. The cabin, once a monument to silence, was now filled with new sounds, the scratch of charcoal on a slate as Elara taught them their letters, the clumsy but enthusiastic notes from a tin whistle Caleb had found, the sound of Anna's humming, now a constant, cheerful counterpoint to the wind. And then, one evening, a sound Elara had not heard in years. Laughter. It started with Caleb making a funny face, which made Anna giggle, a sound like tiny bells. That made Samuel crack a smile, which he tried to hide, and soon all 3 of them were lost in a fit of breathless, childish glee. Elara watched them from her chair by the fire, and a smile touched her own lips, a real one, one that traveled all the way to her eyes and thawed a place that had been frozen for an eternity. Spring arrived as it always did, with a quiet, stubborn persistence. Green shoots pushed their way through the hard, winter-packed soil. The creek began to swell with meltwater. The world was being reborn, and with it, their small, unlikely family. The fear had receded from the children's eyes, replaced by a confident curiosity. They moved about the homestead with a sense of belonging, their roots sinking deep into the land that had taken them in. They were no longer 3 identical, frightened sparrows. Samuel was the thinker, quiet and observant, his brow often furrowed in concentration over a book. Caleb was the doer, his hands always busy, whittling a piece of wood or fixing a loose hinge with an uncanny knack. And Anna was the heart, full of a bright, resilient joy that seemed to infect them all. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple, they sat together on the porch. It had become their ritual. Anna was leaning against Elara's side, her head resting on her arm. Caleb was sanding a small, carved bird, its wings outstretched for flight. Samuel was reading aloud from a worn copy of Ivanhoe, his voice growing stronger and more confident with every page. Elara listened, her gaze drifting to the 2 simple wooden crosses on the small hill overlooking the cabin. Liam and the child. The ache of their loss was still there, a soft, permanent part of her. But it was no longer an anchor dragging her into the depths. It was a memory, a foundation upon which this new, unexpected life had been built. She had thought her story had ended that day on the hill, a tragedy written in stone and soil. She had walled herself off, waiting for the wind to wear her down to nothing. But these 3 children, cast out and unwanted by the world, had breached her fortress not with force, but with their desperate need. They had demanded she feel again, fight again, live again. They had prayed for a mother, and in answering their prayer, she had saved herself. She was no longer just the widow Calloway, a ghost haunting the edges of redemption. She was Ilara. She was a protector. She was a mother. And the four of them, together on this small patch of unforgiving land, were finally, irrevocably, home.